Hello. Welcome. I'm Carrie Brown. I'm a professor at the college. I'm the director of the college's Center for Creativity, Design, and the Arts, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Sweet Briar this evening, and a joy to introduce our guest, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. First, do please silence your cell phones. Second, Ms. Adichie has kindly agreed to sign books after her presentation. When she's finished speaking, she will leave the stage briefly while staff from the bookstore get organized on stage, and then she'll return to the stage and stay for a half hour before she has to get back on the road. This is a busy woman. If you'll line up on the right, your left, my right, please, we'll move things along as efficiently as possible. You can just come up the stage and exit. Exit stage left. So, to begin with some background, born in Nigeria in 1977, Chimamanda was 26 years old in 2003 when she published her first novel, Purple Hibiscus, a powerful story of family life and political drama set in Nigeria, and which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Her next novel, Half a Yellow Sun, was published in 2006. Writing about Chimamanda for the New York Times Magazine, Dave Eggers called it, quote, a shimmering work of historical fiction that reminded the world of the Biafran War and made it deeply personal. It won the Orange Prize, now known as the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist and a New York Times notable book. Her most recent novel, the best-selling Americanah, which tells the story of a young Nigerian woman's troubled and troubling and sometimes funny passage away from her own country to the US, won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named one of the New York Times top 10 best books of 2013. This is really only some of the awards that these books won. Chimamanda is also the author of the story collection, The Thing Around Your Neck, which one critic called, quote, nothing less than a literary feast, and which contains the story American Embassy, which won the O. Henry Prize in 2003. Her 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, is now one of the most viewed TED Talks of all time. And her 2012 talk, We Should All Be Feminists, was published as a book in 2014. Her most recent book is Dear Ijeali, A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions. She studied medicine in Nigeria for 2 years before coming to the US, where she graduated summa cum laude from Eastern Connecticut State, went on to earn a master's degree in creative writing from Johns Hopkins University, another in African studies from Yale, a 2005-06 Hodder Fellow at Princeton, and a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in 2011-2012. She is also the recipient of a 2008 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the so-called Genius Award. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages, and her stories and essays have been widely published in journals and newspapers and magazines around the world, including The New Yorker, Granta, The Atlantic, The New York Times. Beyoncé sampled a passage from We Should All Be Feminists in her hit song, Flawless. Dior incorporated her words in its spring 2017 collection. And recently, Chimamanda became the very beautiful face of the makeup brand No. 7. She is a writer, a humanist, a public intellectual, a feminist icon. She divides her time now between the United States and Nigeria, where she runs writing workshops that have helped encourage dozens and dozens of new voices from her country. The great writer Chinua Achebe, who died in 2013 and whose novel Things Fall Apart is probably the most widely read book in modern African literature and a great influence on Chimamanda, by the way, said early in her career, we do not usually associate wisdom with beginners, but here is a new writer endowed with the gift of ancient storytellers. That short account of her professional accomplishments, and it is necessarily abbreviated and incomplete, or we would be here all evening listening to me talk about her, should leave one feeling a bit breathless. Imagine what it is like to be the person behind all those accomplishments. Imagine the sheer work of it, the intensity of it, the difficulty of it, the excitement of it, the struggle to find time to write as her fame increased, the hardships and the rewards of travel and public recognition, the tension between being a public figure and a private citizen, a spokesperson, and also a mother and wife and daughter and sister and friend. Imagine the full and complex human being behind it, the enormous scale of her heart and mind. My husband, John Gregory Brown, who directs the college's creative writing program, invited Chimamanda to Sweet Briar in the spring of 2004 after Purple Hibiscus was published. She came to dinner at our house, spoke to classes, engaged with students, gave a powerful reading. Recently, I pulled down from the shelf the copy of the novel that she signed for us, a very sweet inscription written in purple ink in a rather girlish hand, and looked at the photo of her. I was moved by how young she looked in the picture, how young she was when we first came to know her, how young and yet clearly how very gifted, how hardworking, and how full of promise. In 2010, Chimamanda wrote to my husband to say that her green card had arrived in the mail at last and to thank him for helping her with a letter on her behalf during the application process. One way of acquiring a green card is through establishing significant professional credentials. "I am still amused," she wrote to him, quoting the specific language of US immigration, "by the idea of being a permanent immigrant, quote, of extraordinary ability." Now, as then, of course, her extraordinary ability is beyond contest. Please welcome this person of extraordinary ability, of extraordinary grace and talent and kindness and intelligence, a woman who has, as we like to say at Sweet Briar, found her fierce. Chimamanda Adichie.
Hello. Thank you. I love Carrie Brown. And the fortunate man who she married, John Gregory Brown. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to be back. And it's been a long time. I didn't realize how long it's been. And I just also want to start by saying that I'm so grateful and happy that Sweet Briar is alive and well. So I was thinking that I would talk about some of the things I've been thinking about, which is to say that this isn't a terribly organized speech. I thought I would just share my thoughts with all of you kind people here. And then I'll do a very short reading from my most recent book, Dear Jawele, which isn't really a book. It's kind of like a pamphlet. But anyway. So I travel on a Nigerian I have a Nigerian passport. And although I am an immigrant of extraordinary ability, which I still can't say without laughing, but it's really very cool. Although I was told that the president's wife also got that. And I don't mean to be unkind, but I'm just saying that when I applied, it was actually for having an extraordinary ability. But anyway, all right, this is the last shade I will do. I'm going to be very nice now. So, I'm a US permanent resident, a very proud one, because I consider America my home, as well as Nigeria. But I have just one passport, which is Nigerian. And one of the things about traveling on a Nigerian passport is that you very quickly get used to people assuming that you are not what you say that you are. To be Nigerian is to carry with you this weight of assumptions, that you're lying, that you're a fraudster. And so often when they ask me, what do you do? And I say I'm a writer, there's always writer, as though somehow I can't possibly have a Nigerian passport and be a writer. I remember once in Denmark being asked, what do you do? And I said, I'm a writer. And he said, prove it to me. And I thought, I wasn't sure how. I thought, shall I write him a sentence? Shall I do? But of course, the thing, and then, so he's asked me to step aside, and being asked to step aside is to kind of feel guilty of something, even though you know you haven't done anything wrong. But later, I was told by my Danish friend that he had assumed that I was a sex worker, because apparently there was an influx of Nigerian women who were doing sex work in Denmark. But anyway, this story is not about the sex work. So, about 3 months ago, I went to London, and because of my Nigerian passport, I've learned to approach immigration officers at different countries with a certain level of trepidation. And so this morning, I approached with my usual wariness, and the immigration officer was a woman, a white woman, a certain British type, brisk and brusque. But she showed zero prejudice. She was efficient. She asked why I was here. She stamped my passport. And then she wanted to know what I wrote about. I usually say I'm a fiction writer. But this time, deliberately, I said, I write about feminism. Feminism, she said. She paused, as if taken aback. Yes, I said. And she went back to doing her work, stamping things. And so I asked her, do you think it's important? She paused, looked at me, and then said, yes. But you had to think about it, I said to her, with curiosity, but not with judgment. Well, because people use it as a dirty word, don't they? She said. And then another pause, and she added, but that's not what it is. It's about treating everyone fairly. Exactly, I said. For some reason, her words warmed my heart. And as I turned to leave, she pointed at my bright orange backpack and said, I like your bag. Is it a posh one? Now that warmed my heart even more. Now that little bit about the bag is irrelevant on the surface, but I'm a fiction writer. And it is a detail such as this that novelists use to ground their storytelling. If I were to recast this episode in a short story, a story about the basic and simple meaning of feminism, as told by a middle-aged immigration officer, I would certainly use the detail about her liking my bag because it humanizes her. And also because it shows that feminism is not about unreasonably angry women who do not shave and who hate men. It shows us that feminism is quite simply about liking handbags. All right, that was a flat joke. But it shows... what I liked about that moment was that her definition seemed to me perfect. It's about treating everyone fairly. And so I want to read a short excerpt from D.A. Jawele. When I started out writing, I didn't think for 1 minute that I would be considered anything like a feminist icon. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I often say that I need to get a hat that says feminist icon so I can wear it around, or maybe a T-shirt. But I'm grateful that being a writer who is read gave me the platform to talk about social issues that I care about. And one of those issues is gender equality. I did not become a feminist because I read any feminist text. I have been a feminist for as long as I can remember, which is to say that I do not remember a time when I was not alert to the ways in which the world gives men dignity because they're men and deprives women of dignity because they're women. I wrote this little book, D.A. Jawele, which actually was a letter to a friend of mine who had given birth to a baby girl, and who then said to me, I want her experience to be different and better than mine, so tell me what to do to raise her a feminist. And of course, when my friend said that, I went into a mild panic because I thought, I don't know what you're supposed to do to raise a child. But I also remember thinking that this might be my opportunity to, in fact, articulate to myself what it does mean to raise a child feminist, to be feminist in the world. And so I wrote her a long email, which ended up being this little pamphlet called D.A. Jawele. But I've also been rethinking. I mean, one of the interesting things about having a public platform is that sometimes people think that your ideas and your views never change and should always be static. And what I have found is that since I wrote Dear Jawele, I am rethinking a number of things. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to read, this is a book called Dear Jawele, or A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions. So I'm going to read the 8th suggestion, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. 8th suggestion: teach her to reject likability. Her job is not to make herself likable. Her job is to be her full self, a self that is honest and aware of the equal humanity of other people. Remember I told you how upsetting it was to me that our friend Chioma would often tell me that people would not like something I wanted to say or do? I always felt from her the unspoken pressure to change myself to fit some mold that would please an amorphous entity called people. It was upsetting because we want those close to us to encourage us to be our most authentic selves. Please do not ever put this pressure on your daughter. We teach girls to be likable, to be nice, to be false, and we do not teach boys the same. This is dangerous. Many sexual predators have capitalized on this. Many girls remain silent when abused because they want to be nice. Many girls spend too much time trying to be nice to people who do them harm. Many girls think of the feelings of those who are hurting them. This is the catastrophic consequence of likability. We have a world full of women who are unable to exhale fully because they have for so long been conditioned to fold themselves into shapes to make themselves likable. All right, so apparently this seems to have taken off among certain circles of young women in Nigeria, reject likability. And so I was recently in Lagos, and a man said to me, in Nigeria, because I'm now known as a feminist, I am often held responsible for all kinds of things. The breakdown of marriages. And so this man came to me and he said, you're teaching young girls to be horrible. And, I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, you said reject likability. And so because you said that, now they're really horrible and mean. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought, I wanted to be fair. And I thought, maybe I can see how that can be read as saying, don't be nice, which is not what it means. To say that we need to teach girls to reject likability is to say that we need to teach them not to change themselves in ways that are false or untrue because they want to please. I think all human beings like to be liked. I think it's part of our self-preservation. But it is girls who are raised to think they need to be liked. And I find this to be very dangerous. And it's also interesting to me that there are mixed messages. Young girls get very mixed messages today. On the one hand, they're raised according to the gospel of positive self-esteem, especially in this country, where people get, you get an A for trying hard, even if you don't get it right. Because we're told that we need to protect the self-esteem of kids. I'm sure you can tell what I think about that. But anyway, so we have young girls who are being raised on this gospel of positive self-esteem, which has some benefits. But on the other hand, young girls receive these messages, these societal messages, telling them that they have to be likable, that they have to reduce themselves, that they have to, in many ways, disavow their success or their ambition. And so I find it to be conflicting. How as a woman can you show ambition and confidence and strength and at the same time follow the societal rules of likability? All over the world, women are socialized to think of love as their ability to sacrifice, as their ability to give. I was just looking at a cartoon earlier today of a Nigerian woman who, in this cartoon, she has about 5 hands, 5 arms, and with one, she's comforting a baby. With the other, she's cooking. With the other, she's comforting a man who appears to be her husband who's sick in bed. With the other, she's trading goods in the market. And with the other one, she is making a bed, I think. And this cartoon was apparently done by a man who said, "This is why I love my mother." And it made me think. Because I think that cartoon in some ways captures this idea of what are the things that we praise women for, how much they sacrifice and how much they give. I think love is about giving, but love is also about expecting to be given. Love is also about taking. And so to say that we should teach girls to reject likability is to say to them, you should dare to see loving as giving and as taking. It is to teach girls that they are not mere objects to be liked or disliked, but that they themselves are subjects who can like or dislike. Another thing that I have found myself rethinking, or wondering if I need to clarify further in this book, is the idea of reversing things. And so I'm often asked, well, what's the feminist response to something? And of course, I should say that one of the burdens of being this feminist icon is that half the time I don't know the answer to anything. So I'm often thinking, do I pretend that I know the answer, or do I just tell them I have no idea what's going on? And even that, it has its own challenges. But in general, I say that I think that feminism is always contextual, that it always depends on context, but that I have 2 tools in thinking about feminism. And the first tool is the premise that you start off with for a woman. And the premise is, I matter equally, full stop. I think that if you walk with that premise as a woman, then it just becomes clear to you when things are unjust. The second premise in the book, this is the one that I found myself rethinking, is, can you reverse something and get the same result? In other words, the questions people will ask me, my husband cheated, and people say I should leave, but I don't want to leave. And then I say, well, let's reverse it. If you cheated, what would happen? And so for sort of simple examples, it seems to work. But increasingly, I'm not sure that tool is the best tool, because I think that there are assumptions about that tool that that I just find myself questioning. I don't think that it's possible to reverse everything, just simply because feminism is about acknowledging that men and women have different experiences, that the world treats us differently. And so sometimes we can't reverse, and I'll give you an example. So first of all, when I was growing up, I'm the 5th of 6 children, and my brothers, I have an elder brother and a younger brother, and so the 3 of us were sort of the 3 musketeers when we were growing up. We had a lot of fun. We played football together. We fought. We did everything together, and we fought quite a bit, especially my older brother, Kay, and me. And whenever we fought, the one word that just was anathema, that we were not supposed to say, was bastard. I don't know why, but once in a while, Okay would, in the middle of fighting with me, say to me, bastard. And then I would race upstairs to my mother and say, Okay called me bastard. And my mother would make such a fuss of it. She would ask him to come upstairs. She would talk to him. For hours. She would say, don't ever call your sister a bastard. So bastard took on this sort of halo of... And I also have to say that I did call Okay bastard from time to time. And so I remember this day that we had a relative come, and so this relative was watching us, the younger children, and this relative was sort of maybe 18, 19, and Okay and I got into a fight. Okay called me bastard. So I run to our cousin and I say, Okay called me bastard. And our cousin said, well, call him bastard back. And I was so taken aback that I had been given this permission. And so with great pleasure, I was like, bastard, it's okay. And now, of course, so there was a certain kind of a satisfactory symmetry to this, that the same insult carried the same weight, and it didn't matter to whom it was addressed. We didn't tell our mother about this because I think she would have spoken to that relative. But the reason I talk about this is to say that while bastard as an insult seemed to carry the same weight for okay and for me, boy, girl, at the time, increasingly I think about the words, the poisonous words that are sometimes used for women that really we cannot reverse. I want to read a section from a news article about Zimbabwean politics. So there are two people running. One is a man, Mr. Chamisa. One is a woman, Miss Kupe. A crowd of Mr. Chamisa's supporters shouted slogans and sang vulgar songs to shame Miss Kupe, and many of them called her a whore. Reading that line made me think, what is the male equivalent of whore? This sexualized attack on women has serious consequences. There are many people who would not vote for her because she had been labeled a whore. And it is an accusation that is not, in fact, about being promiscuous. It's about her being a woman. When a male politician calls a woman a whore, what can we call the male politician to have it have the same poisonous weight? We can't call a man a whore because that's really, in cultures all over the world, not an insult. And so it's not about being promiscuous, it's about being a woman. And in thinking about this, and thinking about in the US how, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, so much of the coverage was about whether she was likable. And so little of the coverage of the person she was running against had anything to do with likability, when in fact it seemed to me that that was the candidate we perhaps should have been talking about whether he was likable or not. I think of misogyny as the invisible cup from which we all drink. I think that both men and women are guilty of misogyny, and I say this as a person who I myself constantly question my own feelings and my own judgments. I think that women are often disliked for reasons that have nothing to do with their behavior or their personality, or just really because they're women. And so to think of the idea that different behaviors, that the same behavior, when exhibited by different bodies, becomes that we judge it differently. And that idea that a man is authoritative, but a woman who exhibits exactly the same behavior is annoying. And I find myself as a person who talks about feminism, thinks about feminism, questioning myself about my own reaction to women and how much misogyny I have internalized. I say that because I think it's important, even for people who are self-declared feminists, to think about their own complicity. And living in both Nigeria and the US, I have had the pleasure of observing the way that misogyny functions in both societies. I do have to say that what I often find profoundly annoying is Americans telling me, oh, how terrible it is for women in Africa. Because really, it's also terrible for women in America. But the way that feminism is about context, misogyny is also often about context. I find, for example, that the idea of body shaming women, the idea of very narrow beauty standards is, if we can compare, it's much worse in the US than it is in Nigeria. Nigeria is still a society that has a fairly broad understanding of what is considered beautiful. And for a woman to be larger than a size 8 in Nigeria is often seen as a good thing. And while young women in Nigeria now who watch a lot of sort of American cultural products are starting to buy into the idea that their bodies are things to hate and things to change. And I hear there's something on Instagram now called selective. Is any young person here going to tell me selective weight loss, where you're supposed to lose weight in particular places but not in others, which is such nonsense. But apparently that's happening now for many young women, but in general, I think that body shaming is something that in the West is much more pronounced. I think age functions differently for women in both cultures. I think in Nigeria, because it's a society that still has reverence for age, that women, when they get older, actually become more visible. But because this Western society is one that has no reverence for age, women in this society get more invisible as they get older. I think the laws that protect women in the US are much stronger, much better than in Nigeria, where really they're almost non-existent. I also think that in Nigeria there's a kind of overt sexism. And I'm not sure whether this is good or bad, because in Nigeria people will tell you, oh, I would never vote for a woman. I don't think a woman can be governor. Or I don't think a woman can be president. In the US, you wouldn't necessarily hear that, but it turns out people are thinking it. And so one wonders whether it's fair to say that one is better or not. But I guess my point is just to say that sexism is a global problem. And that increasingly I believe in this idea of a kind of universal response, a kind of universal experience. I'm struck by how women from different cultures all over the world, often because they have been raised as women, have very similar experiences, have very similar ways of looking at the world. There's a woman an American woman who was talking about, she got in a taxi with her husband in New York City, and she knew where they were going. Her husband didn't. And so she told the taxi driver, here's where we're going. She gave him the address, and she sort of gave him vague directions. And the taxi driver doesn't respond to her. He turns to her husband and he says, so sir, should I take the bridge or the tunnel? And I remember her telling that story, and I sort of remember just feeling this moment of mutuality, because I thought, this is exactly what happens in Lagos, but in a different way. It's like you walk into a restaurant with a man, and the host says hello to the man, shakes his hand, and acts as though you don't exist. And it's that idea of the continuing invisibility of women that interests me very much, particularly because it's not a big and dramatic thing, but I think the little things matter. The little things matter. I think they matter even more now that America is different. America is changing. I have been here for 20 years, off and on, and I've never felt the mix of emotions about this country that I feel now. And something happened yesterday that I think came close to clarifying for me what I'm thinking and feeling about America. My American home is in Maryland. It's a lovely suburb outside of Baltimore, where my husband and I live with our 3-year-old daughter. And so yesterday I went to pick up something for my daughter, and it was in a big shopping mall, and there were all kinds of shops and things, and a very big parking lot. So I had just parked my car, and next to me was a truck, and in that truck was a white man, an older white man. And so I parked my car, and I'm getting out of the car, and he next thing I see is he's sort of leaning out of his window toward me. And my first reaction was visceral panic. I remember thinking, my God, my first thought was he's going to hurt me somehow. And then I thought, no, he's going to scream the N-word at me. And then I thought, no, he has a gun. He's going to shoot me because he doesn't like black people. And then this guy just says to me, I like your hair. And later I sat in my car and I actually came very close to tears because I thought there's something very sad about how this is what America has become. I've never felt that way before. I've never felt a visceral, present terror about my safety. But on the other hand, I think that looking at it in a way that's detached and objective, it's not that surprising that I feel that way. One only has to read the news. And so it made me think a lot about where America is going. There's a lot that, it's not so much, there are many countries that are doing sort of heading to the right in the way that the US is right now. And I should be specific. What I mean is the idea that immigrants are dehumanized, that asylum seekers are seen somehow as inherently evil, that people who want to leave their homes because they want more, because they want better, are demonized. Now, one can agree or disagree about whether they should be allowed to stay in the US, but to somehow rob them of their humanity, to take their children and put them in cages, is the kind of thing that I never thought would happen in America. And so what's happening, I think, for me is a kind of sadness that America is spiraling into ordinariness. America is not supposed to be ordinary. I think that's the whole point of it. I think it's the reason that people from all over the world look to America. But now it's really, really spiraling very quickly into a kind of sad ordinariness. And it breaks my heart. And so I want to talk to the young people here and to say you need to walk and do everything you can to stop that spiraling. And I say this as a person who obviously is not American, as you know, because I have that Nigerian passport, but as a person who cares very deeply about what America represents, the real values that America represents. I was watching and again, living in America the past 2 years has made me realize how urgent feminism is. Feminism is no longer just about the theory of feminism and arguing about, I don't even know, second wave and first wave or whatever those things mean. Right now, it's about talking about women having the right to do what they want with their bodies. It means women having a sense of dignity. It means women knowing that the person who is the president of their country doesn't think of them as just mere objects whose body parts can be grabbed. In watching the hearings, the Supreme Court nomination hearings, I remember thinking two things. Well, I was one of those women who was almost in tears. So apparently it seems to be that America was divided between the women who were in tears watching this woman who was talking about her experience and the women who were not in tears. And so I'm here to say very proudly that I was in tears. But it wasn't, for me, it wasn't so much what she had experienced, and I believed her, and I believe her. But it was watching how she twisted herself into shapes to be helpful and nice and pleasant, that you could tell she knew she couldn't afford to be angry, even though she had every damn reason to be angry. And that was what broke my heart, because I thought, you're not even allowed rage about something you experienced. Oops, sorry. And I thought I had switched it off. And then, of course, the reverse was watching the man she had accused, who exhibited the most petulant, whiny persona, and somehow that was seen as a strength. I found that fascinating and clarifying because it made me think about that idea of likability, that clearly this woman felt compelled to practice likability, and with good reason, because we see that even though she did, she still was mocked publicly. And I remember watching the president mocking her, and I remember seeing, standing behind him, people who were laughing. And I just thought, what does that mean? I mean, what do you tell your children when you go home? That it's okay to laugh, to mock a person? And there's something very gendered about that laughter. And I mean, obviously it was men and women laughing, but I mean gendered in the sense that the subject of the laughter was a woman. And it's that idea somehow that somehow there's a lack of internal coherence in women. Right? And here's what I mean. I've never understood the idea that large numbers of people seem to believe that many women will wake up one day and just decide to lie about having been sexually assaulted. And apparently they want to do this because they want to be famous. And I know many women who want to be famous. I don't know one single woman who would like to be famous for having been sexually assaulted. And so I think to believe this idea that, culture is full of women who lie about these things is to fundamentally think of women as not being fully human. Because if you did think about women as fully human and as complex, then the first option would be to question that, because it makes no sense. It makes sense only if you think women are fundamentally stupid. Okay. Actually, I was going to talk about literature, but I think I got carried away. I'm sorry? Oh, I thought someone said something. All right, so what I would like to do is read another little bit, which I now can't find. I want to read another section from D.A. Jawele. Okay. Which is the bit about love and sex, but I can't seem to find it. Okay. So, talk to her about sex and start early. It will probably be a bit awkward, but it is necessary. Remember that seminar we went to in class 3, where we were supposed to be taught about sexuality, but instead we listened to vague semi-threats about how talking to boys would end up with us being pregnant and disgraced. I remember that hall and that seminar as a place filled with shame, ugly shame, the particular brand of shame that has to do with being female. May your daughter never encounter it. Don't pretend that sex is merely a controlled act of reproduction or an only in marriage act, because that is disingenuous. You and your husband were having sex long before marriage, and your daughter will probably know this by the time she's 12. Tell her that sex can be a beautiful thing and that, apart from the obvious physical consequences for her as the woman, it can also have emotional consequences. Tell her that her body belongs to her and to her alone, that she should never feel the need to say yes to something she does not want or something she feels pressured to do. Teach her that saying no when no feels right is something to be proud of. Tell her you think it's best to wait until she's an adult before she has sex, but be prepared because she might not wait until she's 18. And if she doesn't wait, you have to make sure she's able to tell you that she hasn't. It's not enough to say you want to raise a daughter who can tell you anything. You have to give her the language to talk to you. And I mean this in a literal way. What should she call it? What word should she use? I remember people used Ike when I was a child to mean both anus and vagina. Anus was the easier meaning, but it left everything vague, and I never quite knew how to say, for example, that I had an itch in my vagina. Most childhood development experts say it is best to have children call sexual organs by their proper biological names. I agree, but that is a decision you have to make. You should decide what name you want her to call it. But what matters is that there must be a name, and it cannot be a name that is weighed down with shame. To make sure she doesn't inherit shame from you, you have to free yourself of your own inherited shame. And I know how terribly difficult that is. In every culture in the world, female sexuality is about shame. Even cultures that expect women to be sexy still do not expect them to be sexual. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I want to talk about... Somebody asked me once, so this is a book about raising a girl, a baby girl, and somebody, again, a Nigerian man, it's always Nigerian men, a Nigerian man asked me, well, why are you just talking about raising girls? What about raising boys? Which I thought was a fair question. And I've actually found myself thinking about it a lot because my concept of feminism is a movement of women and men. I think that men have to come on board. I think that we can make all the changes we want to women and for women. If men do not change, nothing changes. And so I think if I were to write this book for a friend whose baby was a boy, I think I would probably start by saying that the most important thing is that to start a very deliberate project of remaking masculinity. And what I mean by this is, I think many of the problems that we associate with men, and you know, I'm also interested in the conversation about is it nature or is it nurture? But for me, the answer to that conversation is we don't know. We don't know because for so long, we have depended on the nature thing. So we've pushed things at boys and girls because we say that's what boys and girls do. But we don't know. And I don't think we'll know until we actually deliberately start to focus on nurture. And so to remake masculinity would be to start off very early to teach boys that vulnerability is a human thing, not a thing for girls, a human thing. And in fact, to expect vulnerability from them. Right now, part of the problem, I think, of masculinity is this idea that men are afraid of being seen to be weak, not just by other men, but also by women. And so often I say that not only do we need to teach boys that it's okay to cry, not only should we expect boys to cry, but we also need to teach girls that it's okay for boys to cry. And for me, to remake masculinity also means to give men the language to express emotion. When I watch, actually I don't really watch, but my husband is Nigerian, but one of the vices he has picked up in America is an unreasonable passion for American football. Which means that our house on certain days is full of shouting and troublingly loud expressions like, "Go Ravens!" And our 3-year-old daughter has also been forced into this cult. She recently got a Ravens shirt, much to my sadness, because I have to say that for me, football is something that people do when they kick a ball, something that people do when we watch the World Cup. Okay, moving on. I was talking about remaking masculinity, giving men the language of emotion, but also kind of holding men responsible. That idea that a boy cleans his room and he gets praise. Why? I think that we should raise boys to know that we expect domestic abilities from them. I often say to women in Nigeria that the knowledge of cooking does not come pre-installed in a vagina. It really is. And so the idea being that domestic skills are learned. Anybody can learn them. And if we raise boys very early on to know that this is expected of them, not something they do to get praise, not something they do when it's cute, but just something they do. I've observed many progressive families, well-meaning, but because we're so deeply entrenched in the sexist perceptions of boys and girls, I've seen many progressive families where, because the boy has cleaned his room, he gets excessive praise, as though somehow, it's similar to the way that in many parts of the world today still, and I'm talking about progressive circles, men get a lot of praise for caring for their children. I have always found that really interesting. And I have to say that even personally, I've experienced it. My husband is a very present parent. I mean, so present that at some point I got very resentful because I thought our daughter liked him better than she liked me. But so I want to warn you that this is one of the perils of a feminist marriage. Your child might like the man better. So I have been trying consistently to manipulate her so that she likes me better. But no, but what I mean though is that so I'm fortunate to be married to a lovely, kind, gentle man, and I'm struck by how members of my family, members of his family are constantly praising him because when she was a little baby, they were shocked that he could change the diapers. And sometimes I remember once after I had her, I didn't want to go anywhere. I just wanted to spend my whole time holding my baby. But finally, when she was about 5 months old, I went off for a day, and I came back the next day. But all my family, they were like, "What's going to happen to the baby?" And I thought, she's with her father. Why is that so? And then they were calling him. They're like, "Is everything okay? Do you need?" And it seems to me that there's something about it that is bad for men. This kind of infantilizing of men. This kind of sort of having such low standards that we praise them for the smallest thing. I do have to say that to his credit, he was vaguely irritated by the praise. There are many men who expect the praise. But one little story about how this, so a few weeks ago, I had an event in London. So I went to London ahead of my husband and daughter. They came and joined me 2 days later. And he said that at the airport in London, he was asked to step aside and he was questioned because they're not used to men traveling alone with a little, my daughter is 3, and they kept saying, "Does the mother know where she is?" And my husband was very upset, and he said, "She's my daughter." And then they said to him, "We need proof that the mother knows." And it was actually quite serious. So I remember when he told me this thinking, I thought this is unfair. In the same way I think that we need to change the rules that just automatically assign ability to people based on gender, the way that we think that, sort of the mother is always the better parent, which is completely not true. But at the same time, I couldn't help feeling an ever so slight twinge of joy, because I thought, this is what it means to be privileged, right? This is what it means to have power that you haven't worked for. So this woman at the airport just assumes that because I'm the mother, I am a better parent, and I'm the one who should be traveling with my child. And I couldn't help it. I enjoyed it just a little bit. But, so my poor husband, what my poor husband had to do, fortunately, we had just exchanged text messages, in which I had said, "Oh, I can't wait until you both come." So he actually had to show this woman our personal messages. And that's how he was allowed to go through with our daughter. So I'm just saying, for the women here, if you have a moment of rage about all the horrible sexist things happening in the world, just remember my husband being harassed at the airport and hopefully feel a little better about it. But I really do think that it's important, the project of remaking masculinity. And increasingly, I want to meet and talk to young men because, especially when they're quite young, because that's also when they're likely to listen to a woman. And the sad thing about this culture is that men listen to men. And the older they get, I think the more difficult it is to reach them because that hard cage of masculinity that society constructs has already trapped them in. When I talk about giving men the language, I also increasingly think that it would be helpful, actually, to use shame in useful ways. Hear me out. in general, I don't like shaming. I mean, well, actually, that's not true. There are people who I think deserve to be shamed. I was going to go into another rant about the person who is president, but I'm going to move on. I think that shame, and what I mean is, what if, for example, with little boys, baby boys, toddler boys, we made them feel ashamed for not being vulnerable? What if we made them feel ashamed for not talking about emotions? Because right now we already use shame in raising children, but the question is, what is it we shame them for? If my cousin who has a toddler was at a playground in Nigeria recently, and she said that a little boy who was about 2.5 was playing with her daughter, and then he fell down, he started to cry. And his mother very quickly said, "Stop crying, be a man." And I remember thinking, and my cousin was horrified, and she said she went and picked up the boy. But it made me think about how early we start to construct this ugly, ugly cage in which we trap men. And I'm not here to say somehow that, obviously men as a group benefit from the way that society is structured, but I think that there's room in there for nuance, and that nuance is for all of us to recognize that men also suffer from patriarchy, and that if we all sort of collectively decide that we want to remake masculinity, it will be better off for all of us. The last thing I want to say is that I think men should be denied the right to anger, at least until women have the full right to anger. And and I say this because anger is it's so interesting to me that, and I'm curious in reading about different cultures, that it seems to be the same. Women are not allowed anger, men are. And what I mean is, of course, women feel anger, but women know that there are consequences to showing it. And my sort of little amateur theory is that maybe that's why the rates of depression are higher in women, because not being allowed to show anger, everything then becomes sort of internal and churning and awful. And so I want to start a campaign, men not allowed anger, women allowed anger, for the next 59 years. So anytime I talk about feminism, there's always somebody who pops up and says she's angry. It happens all the time, and in different parts of the world. And it sort of seems to me that it's impossible to be a woman and show anger without being reduced to being just about anger. I think anger is a human emotion, and there are many things I feel angry about. I feel very angry about gender injustice all over the world. But my feeling angry does not mean that I'm an angry person. And which is why I think it's important for us to get to the point in the world where a woman can be angry, show her anger, own her damn anger, and not be labeled an angry person. So in conclusion, I'm not sure how much time. Do I have 10 minutes to say something else? Okay. No, I don't remember. All right, I really don't remember. But anyway, I want to conclude. I want to conclude by saying that and so there's a lot that's happening in the world about which I feel close to despair. But at the same time, I know that I cannot afford despair. And I just want to conclude by saying that we cannot afford despair. And that I believe that hope is essential. And I'm not saying this in a sort of Pollyanna-ish optimistic way, but in a sort of more, that it's about resilience, right? That I really do think that I'm calling on all the young people here to know that you have to put your hands together and resist this spiraling that America is doing into ugly ordinariness. You have to all collectively want America to remain that place that everyone looks up to, despite being flawed, because no place is perfect. And I'm not talking about the idea that we all have to agree with one another. We don't. But we can disagree while still holding on to a respect of everybody's humanity. And that's what this country is losing. And I just hope that all of you young people will take it seriously that you'll take it personally. Thank you.